Please welcome our speakers for the next session, Fighting Back, Holding the Line in a Turbulent World.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Vivian Schiller. I am the Vice President and Executive Director of Aspen Digital. We are a program of the Aspen Institute focused on technology and media and their impact on society, very much the topic of this entire conference. I was so pleased to follow that last panel because it really established a lot of the themes that certainly we're going to be touching on, but but all of it's going to be discussed over the next couple of days. My only complaint about that last panel is having to follow Roz Atkins as a moderator. So I beg your forgiveness. I am not a professional in that sense. But we have an amazing panel here today. What we're doing is we're moving from sort of the 50,000 foot level that we heard in the last panel to actually three extraordinary individuals who are working on the ground in their communities, in their countries, in the face of complicated dynamics and complicated politics. But they are protecting civic spaces, they are holding power to account, and preserving, in some cases, or possibly building, you're going to challenge me on that, a democratic society. So let me briefly introduce them, and then we're going to ask them to talk a little bit about what's happening in their countries and their work and the challenges they're facing. And then we're going to talk also about the role of news media and the role of technology. So immediately to my left is Sara Hossain. She is the senior advocate at the Supreme Court of Bangladesh. She's been involved in landmark cases before the Supreme Court on equality and discrimination, particularly women's rights, freedom of expression, and freedom from torture. Immediately next to Sara is Nevşin Mengü. She is a Turkish journalist. She was originally for a long time with CNN Turk, now runs a successful YouTube channel which daily streams coverage of world affairs and politics with over 6 billion views. That's extraordinary. And an accomplished author. And then finally we have Frank Mugisha. He is the executive director of Sexual Minorities Uganda, where he defends LGBTQ rights, often at great personal risk, which we're going to hear about. And in fact, Frank, I'm going to start with you. Just talk to us a little bit about what the conditions on the ground right now are in Uganda and the work that you're doing.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Vivian. Very happy to join this conversation. Well, I come from Uganda, and most times I just traveled in. Most times when I'm traveling, one time I was in a taxi, and the taxi driver asked me, "Where are you from?" Like, "I'm from Uganda." And it was like, "Oh, do you know Idi Amin?" I'm like, "I'm too young for that." And then they were like, "Oh, you're the people who are trying to kill the gay people." I'm like, "Well, I'm the activist fighting back." And he's like, "Are you going back?" I'm like, "Yes, I'm going back. I have to go back home and fight on." So Uganda is unfortunately known for mostly those two things, whereas the other good things, we have the gorillas and other things. But going back to the question, talking about shrinking civic space and what is happening now. Of course, Uganda has had some of the most authoritarian regimes in the continent for a very long time, where oppositions are suppressed, dissent is punished, and they are creating conservative legislations to punish every person who is outspoken. For example, we have the Public Order Management Act that will stop people from organizing and coming together. So if people organize, you could get arrested and punished for that under this Public Order Management Act. We have the Computer Misuse Act. Content creators, people posting content on social media, could get arrested under the Computer Misuse Act. We're seeing young people on TikTok being handed jail terms and sentences because of that. And of course, the notorious anti-gay legislation. This is the second one. Uganda first introduced an anti-gay legislation in 2009 called Kill the Gays bill that had a death penalty, which we fought. I was at the forefront of fighting that, and were able to get it nullified in 2014. Then we had another law that came up in 2023 that we are still fighting to date. It is at the Supreme Court. But this law is not only used against LGBTQ persons, it's used against journalists. Any person who is outspoken, they could say you're promoting homosexuality, and you could end up going to jail. So we've had a lot of turnarounds in the country. So for instance, we have a facility that was called the Democratic Governance Facility. This is where donors come together and put money in a pool of baskets to fund democracy, rule of law. And this facility was banned in Uganda. It was stopped because they said it's funding only the opposition. And then we had the Office of the UN Human Rights. Their mandate was not renewed. So now the country office, there is no country office for the UN Human Rights in the country anymore. We're going into political elections next year, January. Since 5 years ago when we had political elections, Facebook was banned. Until now, it hasn't yet been reopened. So that is the situation that is happening right now. But of course, we shall talk about how we are fighting back, because I see resilience in young people fighting back, and of course, a lot of litigation that we're doing in fighting back. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I want to come back to the fighting back part shortly, so just bear with us on that. Nevşin.
Yeah.
Turkey. Your assessment of the political conditions and civic spaces and the state of democracy.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been, 25 years, I guess, since this government has been elected, taken power, 2002. And since then, step by step, the system has become more authoritarian. It's very tiring. It's overwhelming. It's very tough. And, I was joking to you in the back room, and I was saying we're coming from the future, to the developed world. I mean, I'm not sure it's not going to be the same case. Each country is different. But I'm always telling American friends, like, guys, check the loopholes, for example. I mean, can Trump run again? They're like, no, U.S. Constitution, this and that. I said, okay, all right, I understand. It's really hard to change the Constitution. But is there a little tiny bit of a loophole in your Constitution? Like a comma is put somewhere. Do you understand? Like, that'll make a difference. Because these people, they look for loopholes. They have a different mindset. I was listening to Steve Bannon the other day, and he was saying, I know, like, we think he's a lunatic, right? But then his ideas are in power. He says, you guys are cowards, and we are not. We are not afraid of anything, and we're going to change this system. We're going to topple this system. He's right out like this. So, our existing government has excellent relationship with Trump government because they're quite like-minded. They hate the system. They want to demolish the system and come up with something else. And in Turkey, actually, they have been able to do so. And I mean, I don't understand, talking about our conversations with taxi drivers. My taxi driver was originally from Poland, and he said, where are you from? I said, Turkey. He said, oh, isn't Turkey in the EU? I was like, dude, we cannot even get visas. What does that mean? But so, I think because of Ukraine war, Turkey siding with Ukraine somewhat. No, but the thing is, Turkey is a candidate country. And so you have to do some reformations, change some legislation, to be in line with the EU. But, I mean, I don't understand. For example, we also passed Disinformation Act, like many European countries. It sounds great, because what's the theory? In theory, it's like, there's a lot of disinformation in this new media. Nobody knows what's what. There are a lot of fake stories. We have to regulate that. Great. But then this disinformation law in Turkey, how it's implemented, it just does the opposite.
Yeah.
I'm a journalist. I was with the conventional media. Now I switched to digital media, like a lot of journalists in Turkey. That's why I have such high views, because view numbers, because everybody watches YouTube in Turkey. TV is basically a bunch of crazy people saying crazy stuff. So, I mean, unfortunately. So anyways, I mean, when you look at so we have this e-state system where you can see all your court cases, whatnot, like, the files against me is like pages and pages and pages long. Like every week I'm at the courtroom defending myself again, I don't know, about some case that I cannot even follow anymore. And also some things that, sound perfect in theory. So, for example, in Turkey, they developed a system called CİMER. As a citizen, you can directly complain to the president about anything you see in life. Your sewage system is not working, whatever, or you go to a state institution, they don't really do your work, whatever, you can directly complain. But then they turn this into, people watch my video, some lunatic in some village, and he thinks I'm a mercenary of the German government, and he complains about me, and then there's a case against me. I have to go defend myself that I'm not a German spy type of lunatic. It's crazy. Yeah, it's tiring. So good luck to you guys.
How much do you feel? Thank you. Yeah, just to make clear, when Nevşin was talking about welcome to the future, I think you were referring to those of us who live in the United States who have not really experienced this before, and I know much of
jokingly, of course.
Yes, I know, but I know much of the rest of the world is like, you get it now? You get it? I got it before, but now I can experience it more. So yeah, thank you for that. Appreciate those that message from the future. Sara, I know you're pushing back on me when I say Bangladesh is possibly a hopeful story going forward.
It is a hopeful story in some ways, but I think what I want to really start by saying is that I think you're not just listening to us because we're stories from the ground, and maybe you'll give us a couple of column inches when something terrible happens in one of our countries, which is our usual experience. But I think you should be hearing us because, as we've all said, you are going to be living what we have lived for many years and what we've negotiated. And it's exactly, as Nevin says, it's not just that the authoritarians or those would-be authoritarians use loopholes. You have to use loopholes, and we have to use loopholes and margins in order to survive through these periods. So I think what's interesting to me now is, for years, we've just come out of 15 years of an authoritarian regime. But that authoritarian regime, unlike most in the world, was led by a woman leader. And for much of the international community and also the international media, they simply couldn't compute that a woman leader, and that too one who had herself led massive movements for democratic renewal in the past, who came with a tragic history, horrific history of the assassination of her father, the first president, and her whole family, how that person could turn authoritarian. For years, what we saw was writing about the paradox of Bangladesh, development, massive growth, all of that. Very little interest in what we were experiencing, which was unprecedented levels of disappearances of political opponents and dissenters, unprecedented levels of arbitrary detention and torture and repression, and particularly, in fact, stifling of the media, takeover of the media by political forces, but also massive detentions of journalists and repression on the media at large, and control of speech, of online speech in particular, the use of offenses, a combination, actually a sort of heady cocktail of colonial era offenses like defamation and contempt and sedition and conspiracy, all of that added with fantastic new post-colonial inventions about hurting the image of the nation, writing inimical comments on the history of the independence war, any comments which would constitute criticism of the first leader of the country. And all of that created an environment which ultimately led last summer, again, a story which was not really as widely reported in the world as it might have been, perhaps because there were also riots going on in the UK at that time, which seemed more immediate. But we had a massive uprising led by young people. That was what was extraordinary. One of the 3 Gen Z uprisings in South Asia just in the last few years, Sri Lanka, then Bangladesh, and very recently Nepal. Students from universities who stood up and faced extreme violence. On the most recent reports, we have almost 850 people reported as having been killed under bullets fired largely by the police, and 1 or 2 cases by the army. So those students, and supported in many cases by ordinary workers, ultimately led this uprising, which meant in the end the Prime Minister fled, and we had a change of government. And we're now in a transition led by the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Professor Muhammad Yunus, who, if he hadn't become leader of this interim government, would probably have been jailed now by the previous regime, because he was facing a whole fascinating, actually, exercise of lawfare against him. So in this transition, I think what we're seeing, we're moving also towards an election scheduled for February, but it's a situation which is complex, and I think that's what my pushback was going to be, that it's not an easy transition from authoritarianism to post-authoritarianism. There are things that are tremendously better. We can speak, and we do speak. Bengalis are known for speaking and taking a mic and not stopping, so you'll have to stop me in a second. But we speak about everything and everybody, and there are no restrictions on hate speech. So everything is out of the woodwork now. There's massively misogynist speech, massively communal speech, massive threats and intimidation against others, and not much restraint on that. And in a context where we saw the law enforcing agencies responsible for maintaining law and order turning their weaponry against ordinary citizens, there's a huge implosion and lack of confidence in the police, combined with the fact that many police have also simply fled. They're living in our neighboring countries, and some of them are also probably in many of the jurisdictions that are represented by all of you attending this meeting. So in that context, we have a situation where, on the one hand, there's an attempt to seek accountability for what happened in the past, not only what happened last summer, but the disappearances and detentions from before. We're seeing positive steps. Not only can we speak, but people can now demand accountability. There are new processes that have been set in place. There's a commission on disappearances. There's a special tribunal that is trying to deal with some of these cases. The courts, which also were very much instruments of oppression, and judicial harassment has been very much part of our history, not just in the past 15 years before, are rethinking, are now examining the kinds of cases that were used against journalists, that were deployed against journalists in the past, unpicking them, overturning them. All of that is positive and happening. But at the same time, we're seeing that institutions also don't change overnight. So those patterns of judicial harassment we've seen in the past, they're still happening. They're happening to different people for different reasons. Maybe they're not all being fully directed from the center of the state, but they're still happening. And we don't have enough checks and balances and protection against that. We're also seeing this Gen Z revolution with all of its positive features, with very young people at the forefront. But that comes with also a sense that everything in the past is terrible. You have to dismantle everything. You have to rework everything from the beginning. You have to rewrite and rethink all of history. And perhaps we speak with the arrogance of age, I guess, not necessarily wisdom, but at least we can say that some of this we've seen before. And so maybe it's more about piecemeal changes and also holding on to certain structures. That's why I think it's not so much about reconstructing from the bottom and destroying and reconstructing, but trying to rebuild and repair. And that's a complex task.
Yes, and we'll come back to the role of journalists in a moment. But yet, if our unofficial theme of this panel is sort of postcards from the future, this is potentially a postcard for the future, a rare case in the world right now of a country that is, at least despite the challenges, moving from an autocracy, possibly, hopefully, to a democracy, and what that may portend for many, hopefully, many other countries who will be on that journey. It's something we think a lot about in the United States. If we come out of this moment, what does that mean? We're going to come back to that in a minute, but I want to pick up on one theme to ask all of you about. You were talking about the demonstrations of the young people and the notion of this tremendous resistance that happened, the bravery of these students who actually did affect change. So I want to ask you to just speak very, very briefly about that. And then I just want to ask both of you as well about the role of resistance in your country and how you think that may change, whether that will be suppressed or could lead to positive change. I'm asking on behalf of a certain country that I'm from as well about how that's going to work out. So the students, the student uprisings, just say a few more words about that, and then I want to come to both of you. Nevşin.
Yeah, I mean, I think the things that changed, that triggered this, because I said people have seen smaller protests being suppressed. They've seen political protesters being suppressed. And something in the last panel where we heard about the Cambridge University, I think, podcast or whatever, saying people don't like to see things being credentialed. And if you can do a sort of analogy to that, I think what had happened in our context, people became extremely used to seeing political parties and political activists being suppressed. And nobody really noticed that anymore. That's just what happens if you're a political activist. You're going to be detained. You're going to have false cases. That's par for the course. But when people saw students being killed. And there was the iconic moment, actually, when a student stood up from a very poor background, a kind of scholarship kid, and he stood up and he was standing like this in front of the protesters, young man called Abu Said. He was shot straight, killed point blank.
Wow.
And that, I think, was the trigger. I mean, I think that was the moment I heard everybody in court, at home, in the office, everyone saying, what the hell just happened? How could that happen? And the next day there was some kind of sort of clearly completely fake kind of inquiry process set up. And that was followed in the next 3 days by curfews, internet shutdowns, but most critically, by the police continuing to train their weapons on students right across the country. And fascinatingly, public universities and private universities. So private universities, of course, are kids who can put together a bit more money to go to university from their families or wherever. So you had a whole different demographic that felt that they were being affected. And I think the thing I heard from many people, they're killing them like birds. We can't let that happen. So parents came out, university proctors, everybody came out. And I think there was just a sense that there'd been a moment of no return. So the courage is really important, that kids kept on facing that and going out. But also I think the horror of it, there has to be a turning point, something that for every country may have a different red line. In our case, it was this horrific 800 plus. The UN has said actually 1,500 were killed during these two and a half weeks.
One would think the red line would come before so many
It should
deaths,
come
but
well before.
Nevşin.
Well, in Turkey case, I mean, we've been having these protests since 2013, Gezi protests, famous back then. And then lately we had another massive protest when the opposition candidate and also the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, was arrested. In Turkey, you cannot really get anywhere with protests. Because the authoritarian system is very institutionalized. The security bureaucracy is very institutionalized, very strong, and that's what Turkey is famous for. Also, the strong army, strong police, whatnot. Basically, and also they're very careful about not creating heroes like that. You'd never see such a scene, a student being shot like that. They are more cynical, they're more calculated. They would never do that. What they do is basically they let, for example, lately about the arrest of Ekrem İmamoğlu, people protested. They didn't do anything. They just watched. And for days, what do you do? Istanbul is a huge city of 20 million. Commuting from one place to another is a challenge. So people gathered in front of the municipality of Istanbul, for 10 days, I don't know. All right. But then everybody has something to do, right? School, work, whatnot. Then what they did, after the protests diminished, they basically went house by house and arrested almost all journalists. Who basically, because people forget, a lot of things happen. Every day there are a lot of stories, so people even forget, what was the protest, what was it, who is detained, who's arrested, what, why. And they put these journalists in, students also in the famous Silivri prison. It's tragic, this Silivri prison, they built it later in 2010-ish, like a huge prison building. And there's a ward called Jet Set Ward. The Jet Set Ward, that's where the mayors are, the politicians are, the famous journalists are. And that's part of the daily life. It's he's in Jet Set Ward, whatever. He's not in Jet Set Ward, he's in the 40-person another wards. So it becomes institutionalized and normalized. And in Turkey's case, I don't think you can achieve much with protests. It has to be struggle in every walk of life, every day, every moment, every second, different type of resistance.
So the notion of this red line is not forthcoming. Frank, particularly in the work that you do, I mean, the very existence, right, of somebody who is LGBTQ is illegal now in Uganda. How do you resist?
Oh, thank you. For the LGBT community in Uganda, it's more of surviving, really, because we've been under attack for a very long time. But there's resistance, because, for instance, in my country, we use mostly litigation to try and challenge these laws, but also the use of social media. But in general, what I've seen and what I'm seeing coming up now is the young people are speaking out more on social media, protesting even for non-LGBTQ activists, it's difficult because, like I said, there is a law, Public Order Management Act. You need to seek permission from the police. If they don't agree with you, they won't give you the permission. And if you go ahead and have the protest or demonstration, then you'll be arrested and charged under this law. I've also seen where young activists are coming out strongly on social media and exposing corruption, bad governance, and we've seen results. For example, some of our leaders who are corrupt, their sanctions have been imposed on them because of the social media activists who have exposed them for corruption and for bad governance. So there is some gleam of light somewhere. But for LGBT community, litigation is our key, and also, again, working so much with the international...
Through litigation, do you feel like you get a fair shake in the courts?
We've had some gains in our judiciary. For instance, we had a newspaper that was very notorious in outing and naming people who are LGBTQ persons. At some point, even had a tagline, "Hang them."
Journalists are outing.
Yeah. So we sued the newspaper, and then we were successful because it was stopped from outing people. We also were successful in challenging the first anti-gay legislation, which was removed in 2014. We went to court challenging this particular legislation that is there now, and some provisions were removed, some stayed, so we are back at the Supreme Court challenging it entirely. And I'm a bit optimistic, because we do the litigation, but we do it together with advocacy.
Yeah.
So it works in that way.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
So we're going to, if you have questions, we're going to move to questions shortly. Thank you. I was wondering where my iPad was. But I'm going to do just one more quick round before we move to those questions, which is to ask you about the role of news media and journalism. One thing I picked up very, very, very clearly from all three of you is a bit of sort of almost, frustration, I should say, at the kind of coverage that your country receives from non-local news media, just maybe a line or a throwaway line or an anecdote, and that's about it. So my question to each of you, and we're just going to make this one a sort of a quick round, is how do you think about the role of media in your own country and the kind of coverage that you're receiving? And I'll start with you, Sara. We were talking a little bit backstage about how some of the journalists who you were saying were maybe complicit with the former regime, how are they being treated now, and how are the other news media rising to the occasion of this democratic moment?
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a big question to answer in a short period.
I mean, we've already spoken about the kind of repression that the media faces during, under authoritarians, and certainly we saw that. And we saw a consequence of that was, again, also what Naveen said, people turned from the press and particularly television, including private channels, to YouTube and to Facebook. And in fact, Facebook, which we often see as problematic, was a massively critical space and gave oxygen to this movement. Organizing happened there, criticism happened there, dissent happened there. But we did see this other side of journalism and of the media. First of all, many political actors, MPs, ministers, wives and cousins owned the television stations, owned the newspapers. And on the other hand, but that's more like, you get that, right? But the more complex part was many previously progressive, also highly competent, able journalists, including investigative journalists, columnists, editors, became not only deeply complicit, but enabling of the regime, in that they constructed the narratives that I think kept it in place. They explained, this is the only government that will protect liberal values. This is the only government that will stand against fundamentalism. This is the only government that will deliver development. And I think we saw that because, as I said, they were not a bunch of goons, really. They were pretty competent. They could have been in this room, maybe some were in previous years. So they would have their partners, interlocutors in the international media and in the international community. And I think that was something quite, that made it more difficult to understand what was happening inside. And they told a different story about Bangladesh. And so what we're seeing now in the transition is because of the level of, I think, intense anger and resentment, much of it entirely justified against that particular community or those individuals, that is, and without there being any real clarity about how do you address that complicity, and without us having really, I think, a clearly articulated sort of idea about transitional justice and how do we bring accountability in this transitional time. What's happened is that some of those journalists, the ones who haven't gone abroad or fled, are now being accused in clearly false cases. They're being accused of being directly involved, for example, in the killing of students, which I don't think they were. And so they've been in detention now for months on end since the uprising. So I think there's a big challenge for us. Clearly, one has to say those detentions are arbitrary, questionable, and they should obviously be released. But then, and organizations like CPJ and others are saying that. Inside the country, we're not being as clear and coming together saying that we should be, but I think we're being held back by the fact that not only is there general public anger, but there is also a real understanding that they were part of what made these 15 years possible. So I think that's a big challenge for us. How do we tell that story and also stay true to human rights values and not repeat the mistakes?
Almost like a truth and reconciliation process.
That's what we need, and it's not. Yeah. But it's becoming more. It is more difficult because those journalists are now being, and others who are in this situation, are being supported by many of those who've gone abroad and who are using social media and also who've become YouTubers in resistance. But the resistance is not acknowledging the truth of what happened. Yeah. It's continuing that denial narrative.
Nevşin, of course, you are the news media, so...
I am trying. I mean, it's very, very polarized and fragmented, so everybody watches their own media, and everybody lives in a different reality, basically, I mean, I have an uncle, he's a supporter of Erdogan, for example. He literally didn't know the, price of natural gas. He was amazed by the bill he received at the end of winter, so... like that, basically. He watches his own news, like he lives in another realm, for example. Same for the opposition.
So it just depends what media you're consuming.
Exactly.
This is what's happening.
Exactly.
What's been happening for a long time now in the United States. Frank, what kind of support or antagonism do you get from media in Uganda?
Well, I mean, we don't get so much positive media locally.
Coverage, I should say.
Coverage, yeah. But we get a lot of international media.
Yeah.
But we also use a lot of social media. So, like, I spoke about my safety in Uganda. Social media is my safety. When I was arrested in 2016, I tweeted about the arrest, and there was a lot of international response, and I got released. So many activists are using social media. When someone gets arrested, we have the hashtag free the person, and that gets a lot of attention, and people sometimes are out of jail. But also, I think one of the roles for the media is really countering misinformation and disinformation, because we see a lot of that in Uganda being peddled by all these anti-rights and anti-gay organizations. In 2022, I was a target of misinformation and disinformation campaign, personally targeting me and my organization. My organization ended up getting shut down by the government because of that campaign. And so what I did was reach out to news editors, and I started authoring op-eds in our local newspapers to counter this misinformation, and that helped a bit.
Yeah, thank you. We only have a few minutes left, so let me quickly turn to questions. We'll see if I can get through more than one or two. So the first question is, how did the panelists see the role of international agencies, and are they more useful at a distance or being in country, potentially making compromises with the host government that reduces their maneuvering space?
I don't know if that by international agencies you mean development agencies or, for example, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. In Bangladesh, we now have the Human Rights Office present there, and I think being present is very important. It's absolutely true there is a trade-off and there is a level of compromise and so on, but it's important to have people on the ground so that others can speak to them, because and they don't have reconstructing narratives fed to them. So I think being on the ground is important.
So it's sort of third-party validators.
And in fact, not having, suppose, what we saw in the morning video, for example, aid agencies and so on being destroyed, that has, I think, created another real problem, massive problem for us, because you don't have those interlocutors, and not only that, you don't have resources to do certain kinds of work, human rights work, for example. You're back to voluntarism from years ago, and you don't have the kind of resources you really need to do in-depth investigations, litigation, and other work.
Yeah.
The existence of international agencies is positive, I'd say. International pressure works because the government Turkey, they want to stay credible. They don't want to be seen like, out of this world, whatever, irrelevant. They want to be in the game, so they want to stay credible. So every type of international pressure works.
Okay, next question. This is from Mohammed. What can citizens really do to stand up for democratic values in contexts where public protests or disagreement means risking their lives? Which I think is the case for probably all of you. Frank, do you want to take that one?
Well, I think for me, when I think about that, I think about, for example, seeing protests in my neighbor country, Kenya, where the Gen Z have stood up, risking their lives. But again, we saw when they protested against a legislation that they didn't want, and the president responded, ended up not signing that legislation. So sometimes protesting takes risking lives, but there are some gains you can get.
And of course, we already heard from you, Sara, about the students who bravely and unfortunately lost their lives.
But one thing we could do, I think, as citizens also, is collaborate more effectively with the world outside. So, for example, in our case, many of those who were involved in the previous regime fueled oligarchs, many powerful ministers. They have their resources and now their presence. Some in the UK. Our former land minister owns over 200 properties in the UK and has had his property seized here by the NCA, in fact. So there are really useful, productive, constructive collaborations that can happen by citizens with the international media in particular, investigative journalists in particular, to do these kinds of exposés, because those work. Accountability at home is still very difficult because of the issues I mentioned about the difficulties of transforming the judicial system, law enforcement, and so on. But internationally, looking at not only universal jurisdiction and taking people to court for the crimes and human rights violations, but actually going after the money, I think that is one way to expose authoritarians and their enablers.
Yeah, thank you. Nevşin, question for you. In Turkey, the prosecution of journalists under anti-terror laws is contributing to an increasingly restrictive media environment. What needs to be done to protect journalists from this weaponization of the law?
Well, every law, one famous journalist, he's very famous, veteran journalist, he is in jail, not only about terrorism, he's in jail because on his video, he gave an example from the Ottoman Empire. And he said, even in the Ottoman Empire, janissaries would sometimes rise up and change the Sultan, right? So he said, Turkish people are used to somewhat changing their leaders. And so the court said, actually, you are not talking about the Ottoman period, you mean Mr. Erdogan, so off you go to jail, he's in jail. Seriously, for this, he's in jail. And also defamation against the president. So formerly we had a parliamentary system and we had a president who was bipartisan, who symbolized the state, so defamation against the president was a punishable act, but no, this law was never used. But now actually the president is a political person who is being elected, but the law is still there. So also every word you write against the president is a punishable act and people go to prison for that also. Not only that. Well, I don't know what to do. Normally democracy means rule of law, right? But this is rule by law. So I really don't know. And it comes to the dignity of my experience of the judges and the state attorneys. It comes to that because as I said, some of the laws, the legislature we have is very much in line with the EU. But it depends on how you implement it once you're in the courtroom. What's the judge's perspective? What's their alignment and their dignity? It really comes to the personal dignity.
Yeah. Well, speaking of personal dignity, the three of you are extraordinary. And for those of us who are living in countries where we're experiencing democratic backsliding for the first time, you're really, all three of you are really a model of how to make sure that you continue to practice democratic practices and show up in civic spaces. So thank you all so much, and thank you to the audience for being part of this.